The land wasn't just my property. It was my life's work, 200 acres of rolling hills and dense forest that had been in my family for 4 generations. We were tree farmers, not the industrial kind, with neat rows of identical pines destined for paper mills. We were custodians of an old-growth forest, a rare swatch of native longleaf pine and ancient hardwoods that had somehow survived the relentless march of progress. My great-grandfather had started a seedling nursery here, cultivating rare and endangered tree species. My grandfather had expanded it, my father had perfected it, and now it was mine. I wasn't just a farmer. I was a silviculturist, a specialist in forest ecology and management. I spent my days in the quiet, cathedral-like stillness of the woods, tending to the trees, managing controlled burns to promote new growth, and continuing the family legacy of conservation. The property was a designated national treasure, a protected piece of living history, and my job, my sworn duty, was to be its guardian. The problem was the new neighbors. A luxury housing development called Aspen Ridge Estates had recently sprouted on our eastern border, a cancerous growth of 5,000-square-foot McMansions on quarter-acre lots. And with them came the Aspen Ridge Homeowners Association. Their president was a woman named Victoria Sterling. Victoria was a walking, talking embodiment of suburban entitlement. She was a woman who saw the natural world as a messy inconvenience that needed to be paved, pruned, and sanitized into submission. She drove a white Escalade, wore immaculate white pantsuits, and had a smile that was as sharp and as cold as a shard of glass. From the moment she was elected, my family's land became her obsession. She couldn't stand the sight of it. Our wild, thriving, ecologically perfect forest, with its natural undergrowth and standing deadwood that provided habitats for countless species, was, in her eyes, a fire hazard and an eyesore. It was the one thing in her perfectly manicured world that she could not control, and it drove her insane. The campaign of harassment began subtly, a polite passive-aggressive email suggesting I might want to tidy up the property line. I politely replied, explaining the ecological importance of natural undergrowth and the specific fire abatement techniques we used, which were, in fact, the gold standard in forestry management. Her reply was a single icy sentence. "That is not in line with community standards." Then came the official violation notices. They were, of course, completely illegitimate. Her HOA had no jurisdiction over my land. But she sent them anyway, flimsy legal fictions that I used as kindling for my wood stove. The violations were absurd. I was cited for unmanaged foliage, for accumulated deadfall, and, my personal favorite, for failure to maintain a uniform tree canopy. She was fining me for running in the forest. I sent a formal cease and desist letter from my lawyer, a simple boilerplate document explaining the concept of property lines and jurisdiction. I assumed that would be the end of it. A normal person, faced with a clear legal boundary, would retreat. But Victoria Sterling was not a normal person. She was a zealot, a true believer in the holy scripture of her own authority. My defiance was not a legal issue to her. It was a personal heresy. She escalated. She started calling the county code enforcement office, reporting me for imagined violations. She called the fire marshal, claiming my professionally managed forest was an imminent threat to her community. The fire marshal, a gruff, sensible man named Chief Miller, actually came out. He walked my property with me for an hour, nodding in approval at my fire breaks, my controlled burn scars, and my forest management plan. "Son," he said, shaking my head as we walked back to his truck, "this is one of the most fire-safe pieces of woodland in the entire state. This is how it's supposed to be done." He then paid a personal visit to Victoria Sterling and, in what I was later told was a rather loud and one-sided conversation, explained to her the legal definition of filing a false report. That public humiliation was, I believe, the breaking point. She had tried to use the rules and the rules had failed her. She had tried to use the local authorities, and they had sided with me. Her power, which was absolute within the beige walls of her subdivision, was utterly useless against the wild, untamable reality of my forest. A lesser tyrant would have given up. But Victoria's ego was a supernova of self-importance. If the existing rules wouldn't give her what she wanted, she would create a new reality, one of fire and ash. The threat came during a tense, impromptu confrontation at the local grocery store. I was in the produce aisle, and she cornered me between the organic kale and the avocados. "Your property is a danger to us all, Mr. Hayes," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "A single spark, a dry wind, and your unkempt jungle could wipe out this entire community. Something needs to be done." If the authorities won't do it, then sometimes responsible citizens have to take matters into their own hands. It was a threat, veiled in the language of civic duty. It was the moment I realized she was not just a bully. She was genuinely unhinged. I installed a series of high-end, motion-activated security cameras around the perimeter of my property, the kind used to monitor wildlife. I was no longer just managing a forest. I was guarding a border. The attack came on a hot, windy night in late August. I was in Oregon, attending a national conference on wildfire forensics. My phone rang at 3 in the morning. It was my neighbor on the western side of my property, an elderly rancher named Dale. His voice was frantic. "Alex," he yelled over a roaring sound in the background, "your land is on fire. A big one. It's moving fast." The feeling was a cold, sickening dread that hollowed me out completely. I was 1,000 miles away, helpless, as the thing I loved most in the world was being consumed by flames. I watched it on a national news feed on my laptop in the airport. A hellish orange glow on the horizon. The fire, fanned by the dry Santa Ana winds, burned for 2 days. It took every firefighter in the county and 2 aerial water bombers to finally contain it. By the time I got home, the scene was one of apocalyptic devastation. 20 acres of my land, a section of the forest that included a grove of 300-year-old longleaf pines my great-grandfather had called the Elders, was gone. It was a blackened, smoking wasteland. The air was thick with the smell of ash and grief. The old family barn, a beautiful hand-hewn structure from the 1920s, was a pile of smoldering timbers. My home had been saved by the heroic efforts of the firefighters, who had managed to create a firebreak just in time. But the heart of the forest, the oldest and most sacred part of my inheritance, had been ripped out. I stood there, in the ash-covered silence, and I felt a grief so profound, it was almost a physical blow. But underneath the grief, something else was taking root. A cold, quiet, and absolutely certain rage. The local fire chief, the same Chief Miller who had inspected my property, met me at the scene. His face was grim. "The initial assessment suggests the fire started right here," he said, pointing to a spot on the fence line that bordered the Aspen Ridge development. "The winds were blowing from the east that night, straight from the subdivision onto your land. It's suspicious, but right now the official cause is undetermined. Arson is a hard thing to prove, son. You need a witness or a confession." I looked at him and I knew he was right. The local authorities, with their limited resources, would likely never find the proof they needed. But I was not a local authority, and I was not just a landowner. I was a silviculturist who had spent the last decade of his life specializing in the science of how forests burn. And my day job, the one I had never mentioned to anyone in this town, the one that had taken me to Oregon for a conference, was not just for some private company. I reached into my wallet, the one from my travel bag, and I pulled out the small leather case. I flipped it open. The golden shield inside gleamed in the hazy, smoke-filled sunlight. "Chief Miller," I said, my voice as cold and as hard as stone. "My name is Alex Hayes. I'm a special agent with the United States Forest Service. I am a federal arson investigator, and you and I are now standing in the middle of a federal crime scene." Chief Miller stared at the badge, then at me, a slow, dawning comprehension spreading across his face. He had seen me as a victim, a fellow landowner who had suffered a terrible tragedy. He now saw me as a colleague, and more than that, a federal agent with a set of skills and a level of jurisdiction that dwarfed his own. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, a hint of a grim smile touching his lips. "Special Agent Hayes," he said, his tone shifting from sympathetic to professional. "What do you need?" "First," I said, my mind already shifting into investigative mode, the grief being compartmentalized, packed away behind a wall of cold analytical procedure. "I need you to secure this entire 20-acre burn zone as a potential crime scene. No one in or out without my authorization. Second, I need you to discreetly pull the 911 call logs and the dispatch records for the night of the fire. I want to know who the first person was to report the fire, and when. My professional life, the one I had so carefully kept separate from my home, had just collided with my personal world with the force of a tectonic plate shift. My work with the Forest Service was highly specialized. I was part of an elite, national team of investigators, the people they call in when a wildfire is suspected to be the result of something more than just a lightning strike or a careless camper. I was an expert in fire patterns, in accelerants, in the microscopic, almost invisible clues that a fire leaves behind. I could read a burn zone like a book. And I was about to read the story of Victoria Sterling's crime, written in the ashes of my own family's legacy. The first clue was the cameras. I had installed 6 of them, motion-activated and with infrared night vision. The fire had destroyed 3 of them, but the other 3, the ones on the periphery of the burn zone, had survived. Their memory cards were intact. I spent the first night back in my smoke-damaged house poring over the footage. For hours, there was nothing but the usual nighttime activity. A deer wandering past, a raccoon, the gentle sway of pine trees in the wind. And then, at 2:17 Feuchkin on a camera positioned about 100 yards from the fire's point of origin, I saw it. A figure, dressed in dark clothing, a hoodie pulled up to obscure their face, walking along the fence line. The figure was carrying a red 5-gallon gas can. It was the smoking gun. The image was grainy, the face was hidden, but the intent was undeniable. This was arson. But it wasn't enough to identify the person. I needed more. The next day, I began my formal investigation of the burn zone. I walked the scene with the meticulous, almost ritualistic patience of a forensic scientist. I started at the outer edge and worked my way inward, following the subtle burn patterns, the V-shapes on the trees that pointed back toward the fire's origin. I was walking back in time, unwinding the path of the fire's destruction. I found the point of origin easily. It was a single blackened spot right next to the fence, exactly where the fire chief had suspected. And in the dirt, I found the telltale sign of an accelerant. The soil was darker, more deeply charred. I took a soil sample, carefully bagging it for lab analysis. But then I found something else, something that made my blood run cold. It was a set of footprints, preserved in a patch of soft dirt that had been shielded from the worst of the fire by a large rock. They were small, a woman's size, with a distinct tread pattern. And next to the footprints, I found a single, perfect, almost impossibly out-of-place object. It was a single, brilliantly white, acrylic fingernail, the kind that comes from an expensive professional manicure. It was so clean, so pristine. It looked like it had been placed there deliberately, but it hadn't. It had been dropped. A tiny, perfect mistake made in the darkness by an arsonist who was more concerned with starting a fire than with forensic countermeasures. I bagged the fingernail. It was physical evidence. It was potential DNA. While my evidence was being couriered to the FBI's forensic lab in Quantico, Chief Miller came through with the 911 logs. The first call reporting the fire had come in at 2:23 Mitar, the caller, had identified herself as a resident of Aspen Ridge Estates. She had reported seeing a strange orange glow from her bedroom window. The name of the caller was Victoria Sterling. It was a classic arsonist's tactic. The perpetrator often wants to be the one to report the crime, to insert themselves into the narrative as a concerned citizen, a witness. It's a way of feeling powerful, of controlling the story, but it's also a way of putting yourself at the scene of the crime at the exact time the crime was committed. She had just placed herself in the one place she shouldn't have been, at the one time she shouldn't have been there. The final piece of the local investigation came from a discreet canvassing of the neighborhood by one of Chief Miller's most trusted deputies. He didn't ask about the fire. He just went door to door, asking residents if they had seen anything unusual on the night in question, citing a string of recent burglaries in the area as a pretext. And he found a witness, an elderly man who suffered from insomnia. He had been sitting on his back porch, which had a clear view of the Sterling house, around 2 a.m. He had seen the garage door of the Sterling house open. He had seen someone, he couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, got out of a white Escalade carrying a red can and walked toward the back of the property, in the direction of my land. He had thought it was strange, but he had dismissed it. 15 minutes later, he had seen the same figure hurry back, get in the car, and close the garage. A few minutes after that, he saw the orange glow in the sky. He was a credible witness. He had no personal animosity toward Victoria. He was just telling the truth. The net was closing. I had a motive. I had a witness placing her at the scene. I had her on camera near the origin point, carrying a gas can. I had her on the 911 call, establishing a timeline. And I had a single perfect white fingernail. All I needed now was the science to tie it all together. While I waited for the lab results, I began the second phase of my revenge, a quiet, bureaucratic war. I used my federal credentials to access a set of databases that were not available to the public. I ran a full financial and background check on Victoria Sterling and her husband, a high-powered real estate developer. And I discovered their secret. The Aspen Ridge Estates development was in serious financial trouble. They were over-leveraged, with massive loans coming due. The final phase of their development, a planned block of ultra-luxury forest view homes, had been stalled for months because they had been unable to secure the necessary environmental permits. The primary obstacle was the proximity of their planned construction to a protected wetland area. A wetland area that was located almost entirely on my property. My wild, unkempt forest, the very thing she hated, was the one thing standing between her husband's company and a billion-dollar payday. Suddenly, her obsession with my land wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about money. A lot of money. The fire, I realized, had not just been an act of spite. It had been a calculated business decision. A scorched, barren wasteland is a much easier thing to get a development permit for than a thriving, protected wetland. She hadn't just been trying to punish me. She had been trying to erase the one thing that was standing in the way of her family's fortune. It was a breathtakingly cynical and breathtakingly stupid plan. Armed with this new knowledge, I made a phone call. I called the regional office of the Environmental Protection Agency. I identified myself as a federal agent with the Forest Service, and I told them I had reason to believe that a recent wildfire in the area was potentially linked to an attempt to circumvent environmental protection statutes related to a planned real estate development. I suggested they might want to open a joint investigation with the Forest Service. The EPA, like any federal agency, loves a good, high-profile case of a wealthy developer trying to skirt environmental laws. They were very, very interested. The federal government, with its vast and often terrifying resources, was now turning its full, undivided attention to the financial and business dealings of Victoria Sterling and her husband. The fire she had started on my property was about to ignite a much larger and far more destructive inferno in her own carefully constructed world. She had thought she was just burning down some trees. She had no idea she was about to get burned herself. The wheels of a multi-agency federal investigation turn slowly, but they grind with an inexorable and terrifying force. While the EPA began its deep dive into her husband's Byzantine network of LLCs and development permits, I focused on the arson case. The preliminary lab results came back from Quantico. The soil sample from the fire's origin point was saturated with a specific chemical cocktail, a unique blend of hydrocarbons that was the signature of a high-octane gasoline, mixed with a synthetic accelerant designed to burn hotter and faster. It was a professional-grade arsonist tool. The white acrylic fingernail was even more interesting. They had been unable to extract a full DNA profile from it, but they had found trace elements. Specifically, they had found microscopic particles of a very specific, very expensive, and very rare brand of French hand lotion. A brand I discovered with a quick online search that was sold exclusively at a single high-end spa in the nearby city. The same spa that Victoria Sterling had a standing weekly appointment at, according to a discreet inquiry my colleagues at the FBI were able to make. The circumstantial evidence was now a thick, suffocating blanket. We had her at the scene, we had her motive, and we now had a piece of physical evidence that was linked, albeit tangentially, to her personal habits. It was a beautiful, elegant chain of evidence, but it was still circumstantial. I needed something more. I needed a confession, and I knew that the only way to get a confession from a narcissist like Victoria was to dismantle her world, piece by piece, until the confession was the only thing she had left to bargain with. The EPA investigation was the first hammer to fall. Armed with my tip and their own formidable legal power, they descended upon the Aspen Ridge Development Company. They subpoenaed every document, every email, every financial record related to the stalled luxury home project. And they found what I knew they would find: a pattern of deception, of falsified environmental impact studies, of a deliberate, systematic attempt to mislead regulators about the proximity of their project to my protected wetlands. The result was a massive multi-million-dollar fine against the development company for violating the Clean Water Act. But it was worse than that. The EPA also found evidence of bribery, of illegal payments made to a local county commissioner to try and get the zoning changed. They referred that part of their investigation to the Department of Justice. Suddenly, this wasn't just about environmental fines. It was about public corruption. It was about felony charges and potential prison time. Victoria's husband, the powerful developer, was now the target of a federal criminal probe. His business was frozen. His assets were under scrutiny. His reputation was in tatters. The billion-dollar payday they had been counting on was gone, replaced by a mountain of legal bills and the looming threat of a federal indictment. The second hammer was the insurance company. The fire had caused millions of dollars in damages. The Aspen Ridge HOA had a massive liability policy, and my lawyer had filed a claim against it, arguing that the fire had originated on their property line and was the result of their president's negligence or malice. The insurance company, a massive risk-averse corporation, launched their own investigation, and their investigators, who were just as skilled as I was, came to the same conclusion. This was arson, and the evidence pointed directly at the HOA president. Faced with the prospect of paying out a multi-million-dollar claim for a fire that was intentionally set by their own client, the insurance company did what all insurance companies do in such situations. They denied the claim, but they didn't just deny it. They sued the Aspen Ridge HOA for fraud, arguing that the HOA, through the actions of its president, had violated the terms of their policy. The HOA was now being sued by its own insurance company. The residents of Aspen Ridge, who had elected Victoria on her promise of protecting their property values, were now facing a massive special assessment to pay for the legal defense against their own insurer, and they were still on the hook for the damages to my property. Their property values, the sacred text of their suburban religion, were about to be torpedoed by the actions of the very person who had claimed to be their guardian. The community turned on her. The woman who had been their queen was now a pariah. The neighborhood's private online forum, once a place for her decrees and pronouncements, was now a cesspool of rage and recrimination. People were demanding her resignation, demanding that she be held personally liable for the financial disaster she had created. The pressure was immense. Her husband was facing financial ruin and a federal indictment. Her community had rejected her. Her carefully constructed world of power and privilege was collapsing in on her. And that's when I decided it was time to apply the final personal pressure. I had the full detailed arson investigation report now, a thick, damning document that laid out the entire case against her, from the witness testimony to the lab results. It was not yet a public document. It was still an active federal investigation, but I had a copy, and I decided it was time for Victoria to see it. I didn't send it to her lawyer. I didn't have it served by an agent. I did it myself. I drove to her house, her massive white McMansion at the heart of the community she had terrorized. I walked up the perfectly manicured stone pathway, and I rang the doorbell. She answered the door herself. She looked like a ghost. Her perfect blonde hair was a mess. She wasn't wearing one of her immaculate white pantsuits. She was in a simple gray sweatsuit. The mask of serene, arrogant control was gone. All that was left was a raw, haggard fear. She saw me and her eyes widened. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. I didn't say a word. I just held out the thick, bound report. The cover page was simple. United States Department of Agriculture, Forest Service. Criminal Investigation Report. Case number 742A. Arson. Aspen Ridge Fire. She stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. She knew what it was. It was the story of her crime, written in the cold, dispassionate language of federal law enforcement. It was the end of her life as she knew it. She took the report from my hand, her fingers trembling. "You can't prove anything," she stammered, the words a hollow, reflexive echo of her old defiance. "It's just circumstantial." "Read page 42, I said, my voice quiet and cold. The section on the forensic analysis of the acrylic fingernail found at the scene. They found a full DNA profile, Victoria. A perfect match. It seems you broke a nail when you were running away in the dark. A very expensive, very inconvenient mistake. It was a lie, of course. A calculated, professional, and utterly ruthless bluff. The lab had only found trace elements, not a full DNA profile. But she didn't know that. And in her panicked, broken state, she was not in a position to be a rational analyst. I was giving her a story. A plausible, terrifying story that would explain how the invisible net she felt closing around her had finally been drawn tight. I saw the last bit of fight drain out of her. Her shoulders slumped. Her face, which had been a mask of fear, seemed to crumble into a landscape of pure, abject despair. She knew she was beaten. She knew there was no way out. "What do you want from me?" She asked, her voice the whisper of a ghost. I want you to walk into Chief Miller's office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., I said. And I want you to give him a full, complete, and truthful confession. You will tell him everything. About the gas can, about the accelerant, about why you did it. If you do that, I will speak to the U.S. attorney. I will tell him that you cooperated. I will tell him that you are a first-time offender. I will recommend leniency. It won't make the charges go away. You will still go to prison, Victoria. But it might be the difference between a 5-year sentence and a 20-year one. The choice is yours. I then turned and walked away, leaving her on her doorstep with the weight of my lie and the terrible, crushing weight of her own truth. I had given her a way out, a path to a lesser ruin, and I was betting everything on the simple, universal truth that even the most arrogant of tyrants, when faced with their own complete and utter annihilation, will always, always choose to save themselves. The bluff, my final calculated gamble, worked more perfectly than I could have ever hoped. The human mind, especially a mind under extreme duress, is a fragile and suggestible thing. The idea of a perfect DNA match, a piece of irrefutable scientific proof, was a story that fit the narrative of her collapsing world. It was the missing piece that made her defeat feel not just inevitable, but absolute. She had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and now out-analyzed by a system she couldn't comprehend. The next morning at precisely 9 a.m., Victoria Sterling, accompanied by her very expensive and very grim-faced lawyer, walked into the county sheriff's office and gave a full confession. She told them everything. She admitted to buying the gas can, to using a chemical accelerant. She detailed her motivation, the toxic blend of personal animosity and financial desperation. She confessed to starting the fire that had destroyed a piece of my family's history and threatened to consume her own community. The confession was a strategic decision, of course, a desperate attempt to mitigate the damage, but it was a confession nonetheless. The local case was now airtight, and with her confession, the federal case, which had been building slowly in the background, now had its centerpiece. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the district officially took over the prosecution. Victoria Sterling was no longer just a local arsonist. She was a federal defendant, charged with a litany of serious crimes, including the destruction of property on federally protected land, a charge that carried a mandatory minimum sentence. True to my word, I spoke with the lead prosecutor. I didn't ask for the charges to be dropped. What she had done was unforgivable. The fire had not just burned trees, it had burned a hole in my family's soul. But I did tell him that she had, in the end, confessed and taken responsibility. I told him that my primary goal was not vengeance but justice and the restoration of my land. My recommendation for leniency was officially entered into the record. It was an act of professional courtesy, a small gesture of grace in a story that had been defined by its absence. The legal process would now grind on, but the outcome was certain. Victoria was going to prison. Her husband, facing his own indictment on corruption charges, filed for divorce. Her community, the one she had tried to rule, was now actively suing her for the millions of dollars in damages and legal fees she had cost them. Her life, as she knew it, was over, dismantled by a single arrogant act of fire-lit hubris. The final act of my revenge was not about her punishment, but about the restoration of what she had destroyed. The insurance company, now armed with a legal confession of arson, paid out the full claim on my property without a fight. It was a significant sum, enough to cover the material losses a dozen times over. The old barn could be rebuilt, the equipment could be replaced, but money could not bring back the 300-year-old trees. It could not undo the ecological devastation, and that was where my true work began. I used the insurance money, along with a significant portion of my own savings, to establish a nonprofit foundation. I called it the Longleaf Legacy Project. Its mission was simple: to acquire, protect, and reforest endangered longleaf pine ecosystems across the Southeast. It was a way of taking the ashes of my personal tragedy and using them to seed a new, larger forest, a legacy that would extend far beyond the borders of my own property. The first project of the foundation was the restoration of my own 20 acres. It was a slow, painstaking, and deeply meaningful process. I brought in a team of the best forest ecologists in the country. We spent months clearing the debris, testing the soil, and preparing the ground for a new generation of trees. We didn't just plant seedlings. We initiated a complex, multi-year process of ecological restoration. We reintroduced native grasses and wildflowers. We rebuilt the habitat for the birds and the wildlife that had been displaced, and we planted, with our own hands, thousands of young, resilient longleaf pine saplings. the descendants of the very trees that had been lost. The community from Aspen Ridge, in a remarkable act of collective atonement, became my greatest allies in this work. Their new HOA board, now run by a group of decent nature-loving people, organized volunteer work days. Dozens of families, the same people who had once been Victoria's silent constituents, would come over on weekends. They brought their children. They dug holes, they planted trees, they helped to spread mulch. They were, with their own sweat and effort, helping to heal the wound that their former leader had inflicted. The fence line that had once been a border in a Cold War was now just a line in the dirt, a place where neighbors came together to build something new. The children in particular were transformed. They learned about the importance of the forest, about the delicate balance of the ecosystem. They learned the names of the trees and the birds. The forest that had once been a source of fear and suspicion to their parents was now their outdoor classroom, their playground, their shared inheritance. The fire, in its own terrible, destructive way, had forged a bond between our two communities, a bond that was stronger than any fence. A few years after the fire, on a cool autumn afternoon, we held a small dedication ceremony. We unveiled a simple bronze plaque at the edge of the newly reforested area. The plaque did not mention Victoria Sterling. It did not mention the fire. It simply read, "The Phoenix Forest, dedicated to the resilience of nature and the power of community. May this forest stand for 1,000 years." The young longleaf pines were still small, barely taller than the children who had helped to plant them. But they were healthy, they were strong, and they were growing. The forest was breathing again. It would take a century for it to regain its former glory, for the canopy to close and for the quiet, cathedral-like silence to return. It was a project that I would never see to its completion, but my children and my children's children would, and that was the point. The ultimate revenge against an act of destruction is not an equal and opposite act of destruction. It is the patient, hopeful, and defiant act of creation. It is to plant a seed in the ashes, to nurture it, to protect it, and to have faith that one day it will grow into something beautiful and strong, a living testament to the simple, powerful truth that even after the most devastating of fires, the forest always, always grows back. Victoria Sterling was sentenced to 7 years in a federal correctional facility. Her story was a quiet, local tragedy, a cautionary tale about a woman whose arrogance had led her to ruin. My story, I realized, was a quieter, more hopeful one. It was the story of a man who had lost his past and in response had dedicated his life to planting a future. My federal badge, the symbol of my power and my profession, now sat in a drawer in my desk. I rarely looked at it. I had found that the truest and most lasting power does not come from a badge or a title. It comes from the earth itself. It comes from the patient, quiet work of tending to the world, of leaving it a little greener, a little healthier, and a little more full of life than you found it. The fire had taken my trees, but it had given me a forest, and that was a trade I would, in the end, be willing to make again. The Longleaf Legacy Project grew beyond my wildest expectations. It became my life's work, a mission that consumed me in the best possible way. The story of the Phoenix Forest and the Foundation's work attracted the attention of national conservation groups and private philanthropists. Donations began to pour in. We had the resources to expand our operations, to take on bigger and more ambitious projects. We started buying up tracts of threatened forest land, placing them under permanent conservation easements, and initiating our signature restoration programs. We created a network of legacy forests, protected enclaves of biodiversity that would be safe from development forever. I found that my unique combination of skills, my deep academic knowledge of forestry, and my federal-level experience in land management and investigation made me uniquely suited for this work. I could negotiate a complex land deal with a timber company in the morning, and then spend the afternoon on my hands and knees in the dirt, teaching a group of school children how to plant a seedling. It was a life of profound purpose. My own property, the 200 acres of family land, became the Foundation's headquarters and its primary research station. We built a small, sustainable campus, a place where scientists, students, and volunteers could come to study and participate in the work of forest restoration. The old fire-damaged barn was rebuilt, not as it was, but as something new. A state-of-the-art forestry lab and educational center. It was a place of life, of learning, of hope. The fence between my property and the Aspen Ridge Estates was eventually, by mutual agreement, taken down. The two communities had become so intertwined, so collaborative in their shared stewardship of the land, that the physical barrier had become meaningless. The children from the subdivision now had free run of my 200 acres, and I was a regular welcome guest at their community events. The line between us and them had been erased, replaced by a simple, powerful we. We were all just people who lived by the forest, and we were all its guardians. I never heard from Victoria Sterling directly after her sentencing. Her name faded from the headlines, and then from memory, she became a ghost, a cautionary tale. But about 5 years into her prison sentence, I received a letter. It had been forwarded from the federal correctional facility where she was incarcerated. The handwriting on the envelope was elegant and unfamiliar. I opened it with a sense of trepidation. It was not from Victoria. It was from the prison chaplain. He wrote that Victoria Sterling had passed away from a sudden aggressive form of cancer. He said that in her final weeks, she had spoken of me and of the fire. She had, he wrote, expressed a profound and what he believed to be a genuine remorse for her actions. She had left a single, final request in her will. She had no money left, no property. All she had was a small collection of personal books. She had requested that one of them be sent to me. The letter did not say why. It was a strange, posthumous communication from a woman I had only ever known as a monster. A week later, a small package arrived. Inside was a single old leather-bound book. It was a collection of poems by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Tucked inside the front cover was a small, dried and pressed wildflower. And on the title page, in a faint, spidery hand, was an inscription. To Victoria on her 12th birthday, may you always find solace in the wildness of the world. With love, your father. I sat there, the book in my hands, and I felt not triumph, not hatred, but a deep and deeply unsettling wave of pity. This woman, this tyrant, this arsonist, had once been a 12-year-old girl who loved wildflowers and read Emerson. Somewhere along the way, that girl had been lost, consumed by a hunger for control, by a fear of the very wildness her father had hoped she would find solace in. Her war against my forest, I realized, had not been a war against me. It had been a war against herself, against a part of her own history that she had tried and failed to pave over. The book was a message from the ghost of that lost girl, a final silent admission of her own profound and tragic failure. It was the last and most unexpected chapter in our long and destructive story, and it changed me. It softened the hard, cold edges of my own righteousness. It reminded me that even monsters are, in the end, just broken people. The work of the foundation continued. We reforested thousands of acres. We created a scholarship fund for students pursuing degrees in ecology and conservation. We helped to pass new, stronger environmental protection laws. The legacy of the Phoenix Forest grew, spreading its seeds of hope far and wide. But the story for me always comes back to that one, small leather-bound book of poems. It sits on my desk, a permanent fixture in my office. It is a reminder of the complex, often tragic and deeply human roots of the conflicts we find ourselves in. It is a reminder that the line between a conservationist and a developer, between a protector and a destroyer, is sometimes thinner than we think. And it is a reminder that the ultimate victory is not in the defeat of your enemy, but in the understanding of their own, private and often heartbreaking, wilderness. My federal badge, the symbol of my power to investigate and to punish, still sits in its drawer. I rarely think about it. The book, the symbol of a shared and tragic humanity, is the thing I look at every day. The badge represents the power to enforce the rules. The book represents the wisdom to understand why they are so often broken. And in the long, slow, and patient work of healing a wounded world, I have found that wisdom, in the end, is a far more powerful tool. The Phoenix Forest is now a thriving, young ecosystem. The longleaf pines are 20 feet tall, their canopies beginning to create that familiar dappled light on the forest floor. The wildlife has returned. The air is clean, and the silence is once again the silence of a living, breathing cathedral. I walk the trails often, sometimes with my own children, who were born and raised in the shadow of this new forest. I tell them the story of the fire, but I tell it differently now. I tell it not as a story of good versus evil, but as a story of how even the most destructive of acts can, through the patient work of grace and restoration, be transformed into an act of creation. I show them the bronze plaque, and then I show them the trees. And I tell them that the true measure of our strength is not in our ability to win a fight, but in our ability to grow something new and something beautiful. From the ashes of our deepest wounds, the final, quiet coda to this story arrived not in a letter or a legal document, but in the gentle, unassuming form of an old man. He showed up at the Foundation's headquarters one afternoon, unannounced. He was in his late 80s, frail but with a spark of fierce intelligence in his eyes. He introduced himself as Thomas Sterling, Victoria's father. My first instinct was a jolt of defensive caution, the muscle memory of an old war. But he just smiled, a sad, gentle smile. He had read about the foundation, about the Phoenix Forest, and he had come to see it for himself. He was not there to confront me, but to thank me. We walked the trails of the young forest together, the old man leaning on a simple wooden cane. He was a retired botanist, a lifelong amateur naturalist. It was he who had given Victoria the Book of Emerson, who had tried to instill in her a love for the wildness of the world. "I failed her," he said, his voice a quiet rasp, full of a grief that was still raw. "I pushed her too hard. I wanted her to be like me. Instead, she spent her whole life fighting against it. Fighting against me, your forest." It was just the final battlefield in a war that had been raging in her heart since she was a little girl. He told me about her childhood, about a fiercely intelligent, deeply insecure girl who had always felt overshadowed by her father's passion for a world she couldn't understand. Her obsession with order, with control, with manicured lawns and sterile aesthetics had been a lifelong rebellion against the chaotic, untamable wildness he had tried to force upon her. Her attack on my forest was not just an attack on me. It was the last, desperate, and most destructive act of a daughter trying to scream at her father. "She wasn't a monster," he said, stopping to look at a young longleaf pine, its needles a vibrant, healthy green. "She was just lost, and I was too proud and too stubborn to ever help her find her way back." We walked to the bronze plaque that marked the edge of the burn zone. He read the inscription, "The Phoenix Forest," and he nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on his cheek. "You've done a beautiful thing here, Mr. Hayes," he said. "You've taken the ugliest part of my daughter's story, the part I am most ashamed of, and you've turned it into a legacy of life and beauty. You've given her a better ending than she deserved." He then told me the real reason for his visit. His health was failing, he had no other family, and he was in the process of settling his estate. His life's work, his passion, was a magnificent 50-acre private arboretum he had spent the last 60 years cultivating, a collection of some of the rarest and most beautiful tree species in the world. It was by all accounts a botanical wonderland, and he had decided, he told me, to bequeath it, in its entirety, to the Longleaf Legacy Project. He wanted his life's work, his own personal forest, to be merged with the one that had been born from his daughter's ashes. He wanted the two legacies, the one of creation and the one of destruction, to be finally and permanently reconciled. It was an act of profound and unexpected grace, a final healing gesture that closed the last open wound of the story. The Sterling Arboretum, as it is now known, has become a jewel in the crown of our foundation, a place of research, of beauty, and of quiet contemplation. And it is a permanent, living reminder that the stories of our lives are never as simple as we think, that the lines between hero and villain, between love and hate, between creation and destruction, are always, in the end, more tangled and more beautifully, tragically, human than we can ever fully comprehend. My federal badge remains in its drawer, a relic of a past life, a symbol of a certain kind of power. But the Book of Emerson and a small pressed wildflower from an old man's garden are the things I keep on my desk. They are the symbols of a different and far more profound kind of strength.